You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is Season 2, Episode 6. Today, we are talking with Tasha Suri about her debut Mughal India-inspired fantasy, Empire of Sand, which came out 2 days ago if you're listening to this episode on the day of its release. And she and I will be exploring the real Hindu epics and history that fueled her world building, as well as answering the question, why are empires such a common theme in fantasy literature? Without further ado, here's my conversation with Tasha. All right, Tasha, welcome to the Females in Fantasy podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Actually, just to make sure that I am pronouncing your name correctly, because that is important, is it Tasha Suri? Am I saying that right?
Yes, that's perfectly right.
Awesome. Okay. So let's jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first got into writing.
A little bit about myself. Well, I'm a librarian and I live in London, in the United Kingdom. I have a cat, so I'm very stereotypical. I probably started writing as a child. I think a lot of writers, that's their usual answer, that they started at some point when they were very young and continued doing it until they were fairly decent at it. I apparently had a notebook that I wrote in before I knew how to use full stops. And I got really mad when I found out that they existed because I had to go back and edit all my stories.
Oh.
So I was a strange child. But I've been writing in the hopes of publication probably in the last few years since I finished my university degree, which was English and Creative Writing. So I started working, as you do, and then started work on a book that I hoped to get published, which wasn't very good, unfortunately. And then I wrote another one, and that's the one that Orbit have published now.
Yay, which is exciting. So, and that book is Empire of Sand. Can you give us like a little bit of an elevator pitch for that story?
Sure. I'm getting a lot better at that now, I have to say.
Practice helps, right?
Yes. Well, Empire of Sand is the story of a nobleman's illegitimate daughter who has the power to manipulate the dreams of sleeping gods. She accidentally, inadvertently reveals her power to the mystics who serve this very mysterious immortal figure called the Maha, and she is dragged into their service through essentially a forced marriage and has to navigate her life among the mystics in their temple and try not to destroy the world in the process.
Yeah, some big stakes there. So this is your first published book. Was there a moment when you knew that it was the one? And was that during the process of finding an agent and a publisher, or like, how did that all work out for you?
I guess my experience of writers is that none of us really know if we've done a good job. We generally err on the side of thinking that we've written something awful and we must never show it to the world. But I enjoyed writing it very much, and I felt like there was something about it that I wanted to at least try and share, or try and get published. And when I started seeking agents, I felt like that was a very normal process. But when I got my agent, she was just so effusive about the book and saw so many positives in it that I'm not sure I necessarily did in the same way, because you can feel quite conflicted when it's your own work. And I thought, yeah, maybe I do stand a chance of getting this one published. Maybe it will go somewhere. And obviously it is getting published, so I guess I was lucky that it was true.
Yeah. So what initially drew you to write a South Asian-inspired fantasy?
Well, I am from a South Asian background. I was born and raised in the UK, but my parents are from India, from New Delhi and from Punjab, which is North India. And I've always loved reading fantasy, but I never saw people who not just looked like me, but had similar backgrounds or came from the kind of mythical stories and legends that I had grown up experiencing. My sense is with a lot of traditional fantasy, and this is a very large generalization, it draws from an established canon of myths and legends and epics that have been built up over many, many centuries. But it doesn't particularly draw in what feels like a meaningful or authentic way that resonated with me from non-Western sources. And I grew up watching Hindu epics because I come from a Hindu background and my grandma was fairly religious. And I very much loved and had a lot of interest in the kinds of stories that I saw in those Hindu epics, which had gods dancing on the heads of snakes and vows that should not be broken or terrible consequences will occur, and huge epic battles that had an ethos that was very different from what I saw in fantasy. And I suppose I really wanted to try and bring some of that feeling of those myths into fantasy, the kind of traditional, rather female romantic fantasy that I'd grown up reading. And that's basically what I tried to do in the book.
Yeah, I feel like you've kind of already sort of answered the next question I was going to ask, but maybe you can kind of go into some more details with it. But what are some more things that are unique about a fantasy, from that region of the world, inspired from, the culture and mythology and history and whatnot from like South Asia, that you wouldn't get in the kind of classic Western style fantasies? What are some cool things that kind of come to the top of your mind that are fresh and different?
I have quite a few different thoughts. You might get an essay out of me. There are facets of magic that I've been told that seem quite original in Empire of Sand. Not to big myself up, but they aren't really original because I feel that they drew heavily from that kind of, particularly, again, Hindu mythos, the sense of dance as a form of creation and destruction, and a world that is built on dreams and vows that have consequences, terrible consequences. Those sort of facets in my book, or in the kind of fantasy that I write, are drawn pretty much wholesale from Hindu epics. I think it's almost difficult to pinpoint exactly what I feel is unique to a sort of Indian fantasy that I drew into my own work that you don't see in Western fantasy. And I think to be honest, it's partly difficult to pinpoint because I do think a lot of Western fantasy has been inspired by or drawn from, in varying levels of good ways, by quote-unquote Oriental tales and Indian and Asian myth and fantasy. So you do, for example, in a lot of fantasy, you do see this kind of image of the woman in the harem who is veiled and sort of this kind of Oriental wet dream. I can't think of any nicer way to put it, and you see it in the writing of, frankly, the Mughal era, which inspired my book. You see it in the writing of Western writers talking about these sort of desire-hungry women who live in the harems and are hidden away from men, and how exotic and how erotic all of that is. And it leaches into a lot of Western fiction, I think, in ways that people aren't aware of necessarily. So when I write about women in the harem who are veiled, who are not seen by men outside of their family, I'm writing about something that is in the Western canon, but the way that I or another South Asian author, or an author from any other culture that has that kind of practices in part, approaches it is obviously going to be very different from the way an author who is completely from a Western culture and tradition would approach it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's really interesting that like there are aspects of, things that are in like the Western canon that we wouldn't think of as coming from other cultures. That's really interesting to think about. How much, and maybe this is another question that's hard to answer because it's kind of a broad one, but how much did you employ like the actual, like you've already said that you were drawing very heavily from like the Hindu myths and things like that. But how much did you employ like the actual mythologies and history from the region versus making stuff up yourself? What would, if you were to give that kind of like a percentage, what do you think that would be?
It's so difficult to say. I'm not very good at maths anyway, so I might avoid percentages.
That's okay.
I think I drew a lot from sort of medieval to early modern North Indian history.
Okay.
Because I've said in many different ways that I was inspired by the Mughal era of India, which is when a particular family who came from Central Asia and invaded part of India, ruled part of India for a number of generations. To be fair, they ruled until the British came, but that aside, I was really inspired by that particular period, so I drew very heavily from that period, from the gender politics to the actual public politics, the way that provinces were governed, and sort of various things along those lines. I did a lot of research about the Mughal period, partly because I just really enjoy reading about it. And then I threw a lot of the stuff I'd read out. So I guess what I'd say is that I felt like I drew very heavily on the history, but then I discarded loads of the history. I won't go into the ways that I did, because I think it can be quite boring if you're not particularly interested in the Mughal era. But in terms of the magic, I thought that I was being super creative and I was drawing it all from my head, when actually that is very much lifted wholesale. So, for example, in Empire of Sand, there's a form of magic which is dance, and these dances have sigils that the dancers can use to communicate with spirits. In some Indian traditions, there's a particular form of dance called Bharatnatyam, and it's one of many forms of dances that have religious significance and are considered a way of communing with the gods or worship, or, to generalize. And Bharatnatyam in particular uses mudras, which are hand symbols. So holding your hands in specific ways has specific meaning. And I didn't realize that I'd just taken that until after I'd written it. I'm not mad about that. I'm fine with the fact that my subconscious was like, here you go, just use everything that's already in here. It's fine. But yeah, it's been quite interesting looking back and seeing the different ways history and mythology have kind of influenced the book.
Yeah, that is really cool. There's one thing that you mentioned there that I'd love to talk about a little bit more. Can you tell us about the gender politics of that time, and then how you wrote that in your story?
Yeah, of course. There isn't that huge amount of information that I could access, nor was I probably interested in accessing, about normal women of the time. But women in the Mughal court both had a great deal of power and cultural clout, and also very little power simultaneously, which I think is true of a lot of noble women throughout history. So, for example, the Mughal emperors had often many different wives and concubines that were the mothers of their sons, and that gave them a position of power. But their households were also full of elderly women, often their people they considered grandmothers to them, or mothers, milk mothers, so wet nurses. The word for the harem used to be haraman, which is household. So far from just being a space that was very kind of romantic or erotic or whatever you might want to ascribe to it, it was very much the kind of private space of the emperors, and it was also a political private space, because the women had a huge influence on what the emperor did and what his brothers did, because they would often fight. In particular, what kind of drew me to that period was the juxtaposition of women who were completely concealed from public view, having huge private power, and some of those women in that private space having huge power on the external economic and political world without ever entering it. So, for example, one particular mother of a Mughal emperor, who often had names that weren't their real names, so we don't really know what their names were because the records are all weird, but she was a Hindu princess who married a Muslim emperor and was the mother of the next emperor. And when the Portuguese did some stuff with one of her trade ships that she didn't like, she was instrumental in them getting kicked out of India. So that's a pretty huge deal. And I was also particularly interested in one wife of a Mughal emperor, and that was Nur Jahan. And her birth name was Meher-un-Nissa, which was why I named the main character of Empire of Sand, Meher, after her. And she was a really interesting figure because her husband was an opium addict and an alcoholic and not super good at the ruling thing, but she was. So she was a widow when they got married. She had a child from the first marriage, and she came into the harem and was like, okay, I'm running the show now. She had coins struck with her name, and she instituted public policy. She brought her brothers and her father into positions of power so that she could actually control the court. So essentially, she was a hugely powerful figure without ever leaving the space of the harem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I can see why that would be intriguing. It's like they have a lot of power, but they're kind of behind the scenes in a way. Is that about right?
Yeah, and I did not explain in any way how that connects to how I wrote my book. I'm sorry. I get
okay.
The history runs away with me a little bit.
I can tell I can tell it's a passion.
It is, yeah. The main character in Empire of Sand is not the wife of an emperor or anything like that. She is in a kind of position of great privilege because she's the daughter of a nobleman, but she's also very marginalised because she's illegitimate, and legitimacy matters in the world of Empire of Sand, where still her mum's from an oppressed group of people that are not looked on well by any other part of the empire. And I thought that would give me a really good opportunity to explore the kind of power that a woman in that private setting with sort of a public element of power would have. So a kind of courtly female, very gendered power. I wanted to explore what a woman who has been raised in court, surrounded by dangers because of who and what she is, would be able to do to survive. I think you see a lot of women in fantasy who kind of kick ass and have swords, and I love that. I really enjoy it. But I also really enjoy exploring and reading about the kind of power that people have when they can't go in guns blazing and they have to think of other ways to survive.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to explore in Meher.
Why do you think it is that we keep returning to the topic of empires in fantasy? And I'll explain that a little bit more. Some people will complain that like it's almost becoming a cliche trope. Although I don't really completely agree with that. I'm also writing a story that is an empire fantasy. But I do wonder about that. Like why it is that we're drawn to that again and again. You might even argue that it's common in sci-fi too. Although I think in sci-fi it's usually people are just copying Star Wars whenever there's a empire. But I don't know. What do you think about that? Why do you think that's like a common thing that we keep returning to?
Well, I think it's partly because fantasy is so big. I can't think of many fantasies that aren't on an epic scale. You know, huge evil, huge good, monsters, and huge magic. Everything's big, which I love. An empire. What's bigger than an empire? You know. But I also kind of think that a lot of fantasy, even when it's not doing it intentionally, even when it's just meant to entertain and give people a good time, mirrors and works through some of the kind of political and cultural issues of the time, often very messy ones that people can't necessarily articulate. And empire is kind of a big deal, I think, in the context of most of the world, but particularly the Western world, from the perspective of a British Asian person born and raised in Britain, or England specifically.
Yeah.
Empire continues to be a huge part of the country's cultural mythos that isn't necessarily interrogated by everybody or spoken about, but you don't have modern Britain without colonialism. And it's very difficult to have a nationalist, positive vision of Britain without also spinning empire in some kind of positive way. Again, very sweeping political statement, but empire is such a big part of history that, of course, people are going to write about it because it's kind of at the back of your mind. It's that sense of what makes Western powers Western powers.
Yeah, and I've wondered about, like, I've kind of like thought it might be a similar thing where it's like, even though there aren't really necessarily any, big sweeping empires in existence at the moment, the ones that did exist, right? Like the ripple effects of those are still happening, throughout the world. Like we still feel it, whether it's being from a culture that was an empire, or being from a culture that was colonialized, or as in your case, like having a foot in both of those things. Like it seems like we're still kind of culturally wrestling with that and like making sense of it. And yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder if that also is like part of why we keep writing about it in fantasy, because we're still like, it's still very much in our, cultural consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know how much I believe empires are really gone. I think there's an element of the kind of, when you think about Western ideas and how those spread across the world and how insidious they are, and how a sense of what it means to be civilized has been so defined by particular cultures versus other cultures. That kind of stuff is like some kind of resurrected beast that just won't die, which is very fantasy. And I think we're so far from being beyond the ramifications of empire. And that means that we still have to deal with it. I mean, thinking about it, the partition of India and Indian independence happened within living memory of people that I'm related to. So that's kind of crazy when you think about it. Well, crazy is not the right word. It's just unusual to think that something so big and something so associated with something as kind of almost mythic and historical as empire continues to have a real impact.
Yeah. Maybe my wording was wrong there. It's more that where it exists, it's in a very different form, I suppose. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think your wording was wrong. I think, it's a huge, tricky issue, and it's difficult for us to kind of know where we stand on it, or even where the world stands. Like that's huge.
Yeah, it is. I feel like we're on the back of such a strange century in history, where it's just so many things change so fast that there are a lot of things like that where, like in the US, like with racial tensions, that's something that we can like point back to. We're like literally within living memory, certain things were vastly different. And it becomes really easy to push certain things into the past and be like, oh yeah, we've dealt with that. And it's not true. And we continue to kind of deal with it in like, subtle ways with the stories we write, especially in my opinion with speculative fiction, because it's not threatening when you're like writing about a different world, or our world with magic. It's much easier to tackle really difficult issues, and you're a little bit separated from it, to where you can kind of see it. And wrestle with it, I think, more. And before you kind of return to your own world, and then you can apply what you've learned, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like there are so many authors who do that so well. N.K. Jemisin, for example, does that fantastically. And you also I feel like we do mythologize our own histories as well. I mean, taking the US example, as someone who's not from the US, it's kind of difficult for me to comment in many ways. But you'll have people talking about how great things were in the past. So, of course, to one group of people, things were super great in the past. But to another group of people, hey, you used to kill us a lot in the past. It wasn't that great. But when you mythologize your past, you kind of erase all those sharp edges and all the darkness and make something beautiful that isn't real. But that myth has kind of a beating heart and real power, despite the fact that it's not a real flesh and blood thing that happened.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, what is it for you that is at the heart of this story? Why did you really want to write it? Like, was there some sort of a message across that you wanted to get across, or just something about it that really inspired you? Yeah, however you want to answer that.
Oh, that's a good one. Power really interested me. I think there are, not to get too deep, but there are many times in my life, and I think in the lives of many people, particularly people who are in any form marginalized, which is arguably most people, when you feel powerless, and the power that you're meant to have, the power that's sort of modeled in the things around you that you read, is one where you go, I'm going to do this, and I don't care what you think, and I'm brave. And that's what bravery is modeled as. And at the heart of it, I really wanted to explore what it means to fight for your own freedom within the limited parameters of what the world gives you. So that's kind of a bit deep, but it is at the heart of Meher's story, the main character's story, is finding some kind of power when she is essentially consistently powerless. And that echoes through some of the stories of other characters as well. I guess the other message is that the power of love will save us, because I'm a big sop, but those are the messages in the book.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. How can people keep up with you if they want to follow you and your work?
Well, they can buy my book. That would be really awesome. It's out in November.
Yes.
But I'm also on Twitter, and I probably tweet way too much. I do tweet about Mughal history because, as you guessed, I really enjoy talking about it in any way possible. And my Twitter is Tasha Drinks Tea, because I also love tea.
I'm literally drinking tea right now, side note.
I have a cup next to me that says tea on it, but I finished the tea that's in it, so that's quite disappointing. I also have a website, which is tashasuri.com, which has some links to my book, and will hopefully have a bit more information about me at some point in the future. And you can also go to my publisher's website, Orbit Books, and there'll probably be some nice information there too.
All right. Well, thank you again, and you have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Tasha. A reminder that her book is now out wherever books are sold. So if you want to go and pick it up at your local bookstore, get an audiobook version, get it online, or even pick it up from the library, you can do that. And don't underestimate the power of the library, by the way. That does help authors as well. Getting books from the library sends a message to librarians that this is an author and a type of book that they should continue to invest in. So libraries are cool. If you want to hear more from Tasha, there is an extended interview that I held with her over on Patreon. We talk about some of her tips for getting published, her favorite type of heroine, and more. And if you want to listen to that and get some other cool perks, you can head on over to patreon.com/femalesinfantasy. If you want to help the podcast grow, please consider rating and reviewing it on iTunes. And if you do write a review, I might just read it on the podcast, as I'm about to do right now. The latest review comes from The Epic Place, and it reads, I'm an assigned female at birth fantasy author, so I would say I've been interested in / frustrated with this topic for forever. To hear a podcast dedicated solely to this topic is so needed right now. I also appreciate how intersectional this is, another highly needed discussion topic currently. Thanks for creating this. Well, thank you so much for writing that review. It really does make a difference. It does this magical thing in the iTunes algorithm that I don't understand, but I know it works. The more ratings and reviews there are, it helps the podcast to come up in search results and things like that. Next time on the podcast, I'm excited to say that I will be extending the types of guests that are coming on the podcast. So I'm going to be having more creators of fantasy and science fiction who may not necessarily be writers, or they may not necessarily be book authors. For an example, we're going to be having a science fiction filmmaker coming on soon. And next time, I have Kelsey Ng, who is an illustrator, and she worked on a number of different TV shows, including the How to Train Your Dragon TV show and the She-Ra show that just came out on Netflix. And she and I are going to be talking about the portrayal of female characters in fantasy art, games, and animation, and how it can be empowering or not empowering. Until next time, this has been the Females in Fantasy podcast. I am Brianna Da Silva. Thanks for listening.